There was a knock at the door, and on opening it, a portly gentleman said,
"I've got you some wood."
This is quite a common occurrence, as the portly gentleman and I are building an office in the garden from reclaimed materials. The 2 unequal lengths of wood looked to be of little use for the office build, as they were rough cut timber cladding with the bark still on. I thanked the portly gentleman, and not wishing to sound ungrateful, asked him how we could take advantage of it.
"A breakfast bar. I'm off to Turkey for a few months to build my house. See you when I get back."
Christ, I hope his house is better built than my office. A few weeks later there was another knock at the door. Pete had brought a laptop for me to look at, and laptop repaired I showed him the cladding and asked if we, meaning mostly him, could fashion a breakfast bar from it. Pete enjoys little projects like this and agreed to try. Pete brought his table saw over, we measured the wood to gain the maximum use and cut it square-ish. The wood is ash, and the saw blade tried to follow the grain, making straight cuts somewhat problematic. But never mind, Pete had a plan to compensate for that. This is Pete operating the saw. I can barely tie my own shoelaces, and I'm not allowed near power tools. Due to the timber's narrowness, the idea was to cut one long length for the front edge and use the offcut and the other shorter piece the portly gentleman brought for the back edge, giving the required width. Joining would be achieved by slotting the edges, inserting plywood and then gluing, which I've since learnt is called a feather joint. With our 3 bits of wood cut, we enacted Pete's compensation plan. Loading the wood in the car, we travelled across town to see Frank and his planer. This beautiful old planer squared the edges and smoothed the surface. Well, it squared the edges, but the wood is warped and not thick enough to plane smooth, or there would be no wood left. It's supposed to be a rustic breakfast bar, so the unevenness adds character. Next, in my role as non-skilled operative, I was detailed to nip down to Screwfix and buy some glue. Screwfix is my new favourite shop, apart from their obsession of asking for your postcode on every purchase in order to gain your details. I repeatedly refuse, which then requires a manager's code to allow the sale to go through, and always pay cash. Pete took the glue and wood home to slot and cut the plywood joiners, or so I thought. It appears the presence of a borderline simpleton was not required for this part of the project, and he completed all the skilled work without my meddling, during which he took photos. First a router was used to cut the groove, which required the liberal use of G-clamps to obtain a straight edge for the router to follow. Released from the clamps, you can see how out of shape the wood is. Plywood feathers were cut to mate with the grooves, and also 3 oak braces to add strength and keep the surface as true as possible. The braces were screwed to the longest plank, glue applied to the groove, feathers fitted, the 2 shorter planks located, clamps applied, and the braces then screwed to the shorter planks. After allowing the glue to dry, the clamps were removed and the wood immediately sprang back to ape the curves of a banana. Oh well, we're not striving for perfection. Pete attempted to smooth the surface with this retro plane that he said was lovely to use but was somewhat tedious, so he stopped and brought the work back to me, where he marked out a curve around the base of my bread bin to remove the sharp corner and followed the mark splendidly with a jigsaw. My job now was to obtain a finished surface. First task was to chip the remaining bark from the edge with a hammer and blunt chisel. A blunt chisel is not imperative, it's just the only one I have. This seemed to go quite well, and emboldened by success and no supervision, I borrowed a belt sander, bought some 60 grit belts from Screwfix and sanded away with naive abandon. Belt sanding completed, a 120 grit sanding was applied to keep the rustic feel, but mostly because it was the least abrasive grit I had, and advice was sought from my brother on how the surface should be protected.
I think the best option's for you to do your best with the sanding, then give it a coat of preservative, which I think I have. Then you'll have to sand again with fine grit, apply another coat of preservative and a light sanding when dry. Then we'll put some top coats of what I don't know yet on it. It's all in the prep.
My brother's use of wheel meant me. Preservative applied, it was time for another trip to Screwfix to purchase the water-based varnish my brother had subsequently recommended. Oh dear. The varnish lifted the grain horribly, so it was out with the sandpaper again and more advice.
It will need around 3 coats. Sand it down lightly until smooth. The idea is not to take the varnish off, just the roughness.
I repeated the process and so did the grain, once again lifting almost as much.
Has it lifted as much as the first time? You won't get it as smooth as it was before.
You won't get it as smooth as it was before. That was all I needed to hear. The naysayers could then be informed it's a non-slip finish. 3 more coats of varnish were applied, and I'm very pleased with the outcome.